The moment my son-in-law grabbed my daughter by the shoulder and shoved her backward into the kitchen doorframe, his father set down his fork, blotted the corner of his mouth with a linen napkin, and said, "A man corrects his household. That's not a crime." He said it the way men say things they've believed so long the words have gone smooth from use, like river stones worn past the need for an edge. Then he picked his fork back up and returned to his Easter ham. I was sitting 11 feet away at the far end of a table that seated 16. I did not stand up immediately. I did not raise my voice. I sat with my hands flat on the tablecloth, and I looked at my daughter pressed against that doorframe, and I thought, this is what it has looked like for longer than tonight, and I let it. That was the part I had to sit with afterward. Not my son-in-law's hand, not my daughter's face, my own inaction across all the months before. That's the part a man carries home and sets on the kitchen's table and looks at in the morning light. My name is Lowell. I am 64 years old. I live on Maple Creek Road in Granger County, Tennessee, in a farmhouse that is too large for one person and exactly the right size for the garden out back. My neighbors know me as the man who leaves tomatoes at the end of his driveway on Saturday mornings in a cardboard box with a hand-lettered sign that says $2 or whatever you've got. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150, the color of old rust that people try to buy from me every spring, and every spring I tell them I'm not selling. The hardware store on Route 11W has my good flannel on the counter and calls me by my first name. What my neighbors do not know, what the hardware store does not know, what my son-in-law, Cade, had never thought to ask about in 3 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and handshakes that were practiced rather than meant, is what I did for 29 years before I sold the company and moved back to Granger County and started spending my mornings in the garden and my evenings on the porch. I am so grateful to have you here on Daddy's Revenge Stories. Please feel free to leave a comment below with your city or country. It means more to me than you know to hear where these stories reach. The email came on a Tuesday in late March. It was not from my daughter. It came from a woman named Tamsin, who worked in my son-in-law's office, a name I recognized from 2 previous messages earlier that year, each one relaying something my daughter apparently wanted me to know, but had not found the time to say herself. The email read, "Lowell, Kate, and Laurel would love to have you for Easter Sunday. Dinner at 4, 14 Willowbend Court, Knoxville. Dresses smart casual." I read it 3 times, not because it was complicated, because it was the 3rd invitation this year that had not come from my daughter's own voice, and 3 is the number at which a pattern stops being coincidence and becomes something worth understanding. I thought about the last real conversation I'd had with her. 6 months ago, a phone call that lasted 8 minutes. She asked about my knee. I asked about her landscaping practice. She said she'd step back from her clients, that it made more sense for her to focus on the home right now. Her voice, when she said it, had a particular quality I'd learned over 32 years of listening to her. The quality of a sentence that has been edited down from something longer and more honest. I typed back, "I'll be there, thank you, Tamsin." The drive to Knoxville is 40 minutes on I-40. I took Route 11W instead. 40 miles of 2-lane through blooming dogwood and redbud, everything going pink and white the way East Tennessee does in April, that annual recklessness that makes the rest of the year worth getting through. I'd been taking that drive, or versions of it, my whole adult life. Somewhere along those 40 miles, I thought about the things I had been noticing, that my daughter had stopped calling from her own number around 14 months back, that every invitation since November had come from Cade or someone in his orbit, that the birthday card I'd mailed in February, a simple thing, a watercolor print of the Clinch River I'd picked up at an art fair in Bean Station because she'd always loved that stretch of water, had been acknowledged by a text message that arrived 17 days late, in handwriting that was too careful and too controlled, the handwriting of someone writing with someone watching. I had not told anyone about any of that. There are things you hold privately because they matter too much to say before you understand what they mean. Willowbend Court was at the end of a gated community west of the city. The Hollenbeck house sat on a cul-de-sac, stone facade, 3-car garage, professional landscaping that had clearly not been designed by the landscape architect who lived there. A white Range Rover, 2 sedans with dealer plates, and a gunmetal BMW crowded the driveway. I pulled my F-150 in behind them and sat for a moment with the engine ticking. Through the front windows I could see movement and the warm scatter of voices I couldn't yet hear. My daughter was in that house. I thought about the 8-minute phone call. I thought about the edited sentences. I got out of the truck. Cade opened the door before I'd finished raising my hand to knock. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, wearing a blazer over an open-collar shirt, the collar open just enough to look intentional. The handshake he offered was practiced. The handshake of a man who had read about handshakes in the same way he had read about everything else, as a skill to be acquired rather than a reflex to be trusted. Lowell, he said my name like he was confirming a guest list item. Glad you made the drive. He led me inside. The ceilings climbed past any reasonable height. The furniture was coordinated in the way that furniture is coordinated when someone is paid to do it. Everything matching in ways that real homes never quite match, because real homes accumulate rather than coordinate. Through the doorway to the living room, I could see a fireplace, and arranged around it, the particular posture of a gathering already well underway. Then my daughter appeared. She walked toward me in a dress I hadn't seen before, her hair arranged, her smile already present before she reached me. Beautiful, and exhausted beneath it, in a way that the arrangement and the dress could not fully cover. She hugged me, and I held on a half-second longer than she expected, long enough to feel the exhale against my shoulder, long enough to register that she was wearing a perfume that wasn't hers, not the cedar and something warmer that Patsy had given her for her 25th birthday, but something different, something chosen for someone else's preference, which amounts to the same thing. You look great, Dad, she said. So do you, I told her, because she did, and because some truths sit alongside other truths. Her eyes moved sideways when she said it, a quick involuntary check toward Cade, who was already turning away. The other guests were gathered in clusters. 14 people, Cade's business associates, their wives, 2 men introduced as investors in something called Ridgetop Reserve, and at the head of the room, Myron Hollenbeck. Myron was 66, built like a man who had played college football and kept the posture, silver-haired, dark suit, bourbon in hand, the kind of man a room organizes itself around whether or not the room intends to. He looked at me the way men look at something they have already priced and found within easy reach. Lowell, he said. His handshake was heavier than his son's, less managed. Good of you to come out. Out, as though I had traveled from somewhere inconvenient. Wouldn't miss it, I said. I was directed to the far end of the Easter table, the auxiliary end, the narrower end, the end where the candles were fewer and the conversation was more dutiful, the end reserved for the people you are obligated to seat but not required to impress. I unfolded my napkin and looked the full length of the table at my daughter. She was seated 3 chairs from her husband. She had already picked up a water glass and was rotating it in both hands the way you handle an object when you need something to do with your hands. Her shoulders carried an angle I recognized now with the particular clarity of a man who should have recognized it months earlier. The angle of a body that has spent too long monitoring the emotional weather of a room and has forgotten what it felt like not to. The first course arrived. Cade's voice carried the length of the table without effort. He was talking about Ridgetop Reserve, a luxury wellness resort in Sevier County. 62 cabins on 200 acres, full spa, farm-to-table kitchen, experiential design, he said, high net worth demographic. The vocabulary of a man who uses language to define the altitude of the room he's standing in, and then checks to see who's still with him. Someone to my left asked what I'd done before I retired. Civil engineering, I said, infrastructure consulting. Cade looked down the table toward me, his voice carrying 12 feet with effortless precision. So, municipal contracts, bridge assessments, that kind of thing? That kind of thing, I said. Myron made a sound, not quite a word, the sound of a man confirming a conclusion he'd already reached. There's real dignity in the trades, Cade said, and the word trades landed exactly where he intended it to. The whole infrastructure of this country depends on the men doing ground-level work. He gestured loosely in my direction, a generous gesture, the gesture of a man tossing something toward someone he's decided deserves the gesture. Later, over the second course, Myron asked whether I'd run my own operation or worked on salary. My own, I said. Good for you, he said, in precisely the tone men use when they mean the opposite. Then, Cade, what kind of scale, though? Small regional outfit? 7 state DOT contracts at the peak, I said. Revenue around $180 million the last full year before I sold. The silence that followed was not dramatic. These were trained people, and trained people absorb surprises without showing the seam. But something adjusted in the room, a collective recalibration. The subtle shift of a gathering that has just learned the architecture of the conversation was different than it appeared. Myron set down his bourbon. Cade's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He put it down carefully. His face rearranged itself into something that was still a smile, but carried a new quality underneath it. The expression of a man who has been sitting in furniture that turned out to belong to someone else. You never mentioned any of this, he said, and this time the remark was not aimed at me. It was aimed past me, down the table at my daughter, with an edge that was quiet but present, the edge of a man noting an inventory discrepancy. My daughter looked at her husband. You never asked, she said. 8 ordinary words. But the table heard them, and I heard them, and Cade heard them, and for a moment the careful architecture of the evening developed a crack, too small to be visible, large enough to feel underfoot. We moved through the meal. Myron recovered first, as men like him always do, and redirected toward Phase 2 projections for Ridgetop Reserve. I listened, and I noticed the way the language around the project had softened since the last time I'd heard him discuss it. Less specific, more general, the vocabulary of a man managing a problem rather than describing progress. I had spent 29 years listening to both kinds of men, and I knew the sound of each. I watched my daughter refill her water glass 3 times without drinking from it. I watched her begin to answer a question from an investor's wife and stop when Cade's voice came in, smooth and final, completing her sentence the way you change a radio station in the dark. I watched her fold her napkin in her lap, and then unfold it, and then fold it again. And then I saw her wrist. She reached across the table for the bread basket, and her sleeve pulled back 2 inches, and on the inside of her forearm there was a bruise in the particular yellow-green of something that had been there long enough to begin resolving. Long enough that she had dressed around it this morning without thinking twice, because she had done it before. I set my fork down. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Cade. Then I looked back at my daughter, and she had seen me see it. She didn't move her sleeve down. She held my gaze for 2 full seconds, and in those 2 seconds she told me everything she had not been able to say in 6 months of 8-minute phone calls and late text messages and invitations routed through a stranger. She looked away. I understood that tonight was not going to end the way my son-in-law expected. The conversation had moved to holiday travel when Cade reached down the table with his voice and said pleasantly, the particular pleasantness that is its own kind of warning. Sweetheart, you haven't touched your plate. Our guests are going to think you don't like the food. Several faces turned toward my daughter with the polite concern of people who have been given permission to notice something. My daughter looked at her plate, then at Cade, and then she did something I had not seen her do in 2 years. She did not adjust her expression to accommodate his. I'm not hungry, she said. You haven't eaten since this morning. His voice stayed light, reasonable, the voice of a man needing the table to hear him being the patient one. You know how you get, Laurel. You know how you get. 4 words that contained an entire architecture of diminishment. The suggestion that her hunger, her stillness, her visible distress were conditions he had learned to manage. That he was the reasonable variable and she was the unreliable one. The investor's wife beside my daughter stopped moving her fork. I'm not hungry, Cade, my daughter said, and her voice was the opposite of raised, the voice of a woman who has discovered that stillness can carry its own weight. I've been sitting with your guests for 3 hours. I've answered their questions, or started to, and then you finished my answers, and I've smiled about that. I'm not hungry. That's a complete sentence. It doesn't need to be managed. The table went the particular still of people working very hard at not listening, while listening with every available sense. Myron set his bourbon down slowly. Cade's face ran through something in the space of 2 seconds. A rapid internal negotiation between the version of himself he performed for company and whatever lived underneath that performance. The performance won. Barely. Sweetheart, he smiled for the table. Why don't we just take a minute in the kitchen? I don't want to go to the kitchen. Laurel. I don't want to go to another room and come back when I've had a few minutes and be different than I am right now. Her hands were flat on the tablecloth, both of them pressing lightly, steadying against something, only she could feel moving. I don't want any of this. I haven't wanted it for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it until right now, sitting here with my father watching me not eat. Cade stood. No signal, no warning the room could read in advance. He simply rose from his chair with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided that the geometry of the room needs correcting, and that correcting it is his right. My daughter felt it. I watched her feel it, the involuntary shift of her hands to the edge of the table, the automatic bracing of a body that has learned what that particular movement precedes. Myron said, Cade. Not a warning, a permission. Cade walked toward my daughter and said something low and directed at her alone, something the table couldn't hear from its distance, and my daughter pushed her chair back and stood, whether she stood because she chose to or because remaining seated felt more dangerous. I have thought about that question many times, and I still don't have a clean answer. And when she stopped in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen because she didn't want to go further, and she had finally decided she didn't have to, Cade grabbed her shoulder and pushed. It wasn't a stumble. It was a push with his full weight behind it. She hit the doorframe with a sound that had mass to it, solid and immediate, and she caught herself with both hands flat against the frame and stood there with her breath coming in short, shallow pulls. Myron picked up his fork. "A man corrects his household," he said in the calm and settled voice of a belief so old it required no defense. "That's not a crime. I have sat in rooms where terrible things were said. I have kept my face still through most of it. Because stillness is a tool, I spent 30 years sharpening to the point where I can't not use it. But something ignited in my chest when Myron said those words. Something much older than any professional skill. Something that came from the place where my daughter's name has lived since the day she was born." I stood up. I did not knock my chair back. I walked the full length of the dining table with my hands at my sides, and my face arranged in the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now simply implementing it. I stepped between my daughter and her husband, not dramatically. I placed my body in that doorway the way you place a hand over something to stop it from reaching what it was reaching for. Her hand found my arm. Her grip was cold and tight. "I've got you," I said quiet, only for her. I guided her down the hallway to the small sitting room near the front door. Behind us, I heard Myron say something to the table, the voice of a man restoring the appearance of normalcy as efficiently as a man straightens a picture frame after an earthquake, and I heard the sound of the dinner resuming its performance. In the sitting room, my daughter turned to face me. Her eyes were dry. I noticed that first. No tears, not here, not with the performance still in earshot. Her jaw was set, and her hands were steadier than they had been, and she was looking at me without checking over her shoulder for the first time all evening. "Dad," she said, "is your shoulder hurt?" She thought about it, really thought. "A little," she said. "Stay here, I'm going to make a phone call." She looked at me with something I couldn't fully read, part relief, part a grief that had been waiting a long time for enough air to breathe. The grief of a daughter who understands that her father has been seeing what was happening and is no longer going to pretend otherwise. "Okay," she said. I went out the front door. The April night hit me like something honest, cool and clear and real, in a way the inside of that house had not been real all evening. Somewhere in the drainage pond, at the edge of the community, frogs were going, that deep, patient April sound that makes East Tennessee feel old and indifferent to the particulars of any one evening. I took out my phone and called Farrell Oakes. Farrell had been my operations director for 19 years. I'd hired him when he was 29, running 3 crews simultaneously on a state bridge contract outside Chattanooga, working harder than anyone I had hired before or since. When I sold the company in 2011, Farrell was the man who helped me architect the exit structure. We had worked together long enough that his voice on a phone still sounded like the beginning of a problem being solved. He picked up on the second ring. "Lowell, I need you. 14 Willowbend Court, West Knoxville. How far are you?" 20 minutes from the office. What kind of more? I had not said I need more than just you. He already knew. I thought about the doorframe, about Myron's fork, about the bruise on my daughter's forearm, and the 14 months of phone calls from the wrong number. "Enough that it means something when they see it," I said, "and reach Frances Kimball if you can." Frances Kimball had practiced family law in Nashville for 23 years. Her husband had been a contractor whose operating line I'd helped restructure in 2009 when the banks were closing their doors on everyone who wasn't already safe. She had told me once plainly that if I ever needed her, I had only to say the word. "I can reach her," Farrell said. "She's in Knoxville tonight, actually. Lowell, there's something else. Prentice has been looking at something for the past few weeks, something you're going to want to hear." Prentice Holbrook had spent 12 years with the SEC's Atlanta Enforcement Division before going private as a forensic CPA. He was precise, thorough, and entirely without performance. "Bring him," I said. A pause, brief and loaded. "Is Laurel all right?" I looked back at the house. The dining room windows glowed warm, and even the Easter lily arrangement visible through the glass. "She will be," I said. I ended the call. I stood in the April dark for another minute, not because I needed the time, but because the cold was honest, and I needed honest things before going back inside and sitting back down at the end of that table and counting the minutes. The counting was the hardest part. I had spent 30 years learning that the men who win the rooms worth winning are not the loudest ones. They are the ones who can hold themselves still until the moment is ready. The moment was 20 minutes away. I went back inside. I took my seat at the far end of the table. Cade looked at me when I sat down. He had resumed his position and his composure with the practiced ease of a man who understands that the fastest way to make an incident disappear is to behave as though it already has. He was talking about Ridgetop Reserve, the Vermont ski lodge he'd been planning to convert into a satellite wellness property. I picked up my water glass. I looked at the crack in the doorframe plaster, 6 inches long diagonal at shoulder height, the most honest thing in the room. I counted. At 18 minutes, my phone vibrated once in my jacket pocket. In position. At 22 minutes, the sound arrived. Low and collective in building, engines, more than one, moving down the cul-de-sac with the unhurried precision of things that have arrived and do not intend to leave. The dining room windows began to lighten from outside, headlights sweeping across the stone facade in slow, deliberate sequence, one pair after another, until the room glowed with a reflected light that had no business being there at 6 o'clock on an Easter Sunday in a residential gated community west of Knoxville. Cade stopped speaking mid-sentence. Myron turned in his chair toward the windows, and for the first time all evening I watched something move across his face that was not the settled authority he'd been wearing all night. It was the territory just adjacent to alarm. 8 black Cadillac Escalades had pulled into the cul-de-sac and arranged themselves with a precision that had clearly been discussed in advance. Their engines cut simultaneously, all 8, the same instant, the same silence. And the quiet that followed had more mass than the sound had. The silence of things that have arrived and are certain of their right to be there. Cade was already moving toward the front door. I rose from my chair and followed, and behind me I heard the guests pushing back from the table, doing what people do in uncertain moments, moving toward the source of the uncertainty while telling themselves they're just curious. Cade pulled the front door open. The night air came in, and with it the sound of footsteps on stone, measured, unhurried, the footsteps of people walking toward something they have decided to walk toward. Farrell Oakes was the first face I saw. He had come straight from the office, dark jacket over a blue work shirt, no tie, which was Farrell's way of saying this is serious, but I am not performing seriousness for you. Behind him, Frances Kimball walked with a legal portfolio under one arm, small and precise in her movements, a woman who takes up exactly the space she needs and not 1 inch more. And behind her, Prentice Holbrook, carrying only a legal pad and a pen, and what he had brought was in his head, organized long before tonight. Behind the 3 of them, 5 more people spread quietly across the cul-de-sac. Former colleagues, 2 contractors I had helped keep afloat during the 2009 downturn, a county commissioner I'd worked alongside for 6 years on a highway project outside Maryville, and 2 men from Nashville whose structural assessments I'd guaranteed with my name when they were starting out and had no one else to call. They had not come because I called in favors. I don't operate in favors. I had called Farrell, and Farrell had called 3 people, and those people had called others. And this is what 29 years of showing up when it matters looks like, when it finally needs to look like something visible. Farrell reached the front step. He looked at Cade with the level, untroubled attention of a man who has already assessed the situation and found it manageable. Then he looked past Cade at me. "Lowell," he said. "Farrell," I said. Cade's head moved between us. "Who are you? This is pride property. You can't just..." "My name is Farrell Oakes. I'm president of Oakes Infrastructure Group. We carry active DOT contracts in 5 southeastern states and 2 federal highway programs. Lowell Stanton built the foundation I operate from. He sold it to me 13 years ago. Farrell paused. "You're Cade Hollenbeck. We need to have a conversation about Ridgetop Reserve LLC. The color left Cade's face steadily, the way color leaves a face when it has somewhere real to go. Myron appeared in the doorway behind his son. He looked at the 8 Escalades. He looked at Farrell. He looked at the people standing in the April dark on his son's cul-de-sac, with their hands at their sides and their faces arranged in the particular stillness of people who are present and certain and unhurried. And I watched something happen in Myron Hollenbeck's expression that had not been there at any point in the preceding 3 hours. He recognized it, not the specific individuals, the quality behind them, the quality of organized and patient wait that does not announce itself, because announcement is for people who are uncertain whether they will be heard. Myron had spent 66 years being the largest thing in every room he entered. He was looking at people who had never heard of him. I stepped past Cade and stood on the front step and looked back down the hallway. "Laurel," I said, loud enough to carry, "come out here, please." A pause. Then the sitting room door opened, and my daughter walked toward the front of the house, her arms at her sides, her chin level, her eyes finding mine as she came down the hall, and she stepped across the threshold into the April night and stood beside me and looked at what was in the cul-de-sac. She turned to look at me. "Dad," she said, "who are all these people?" "People who owe me nothing and came anyway," I said. "That's the only kind worth having." We moved inside because there was real work to do and the cold was real. Francis and Prentice came in with Farrell, and the room reorganized around them, the way a room reorganizes when the air pressure changes, perceptible, immediate, and impossible to precisely explain. In the living room, Myron took the armchair nearest the fireplace, the seat of maximum authority, which told me he was still, at this moment, more composed than afraid. Cade stood with his arms at his sides. My daughter sat beside me on the sofa, close enough that I could feel her steadying her own breathing. Prentice opened his legal pad. Ridgetop Reserve LLC, he said, without preamble, has submitted audited financial statements to its lenders showing consistent revenue projections and asset valuations across 3 fiscal years. The actual underlying financials are different. He had the particular quality of a man whose accuracy has been tested in federal proceedings and come through intact. I've reviewed bank draws, contractor invoices, materials receipts, and payroll records. Not the statements filed with lenders, but the actual transactions. The company has not been profitable in 2 years. Current liabilities exceed assets by approximately $2.1 million. 2 construction phases were suspended in the past 10 months due to unpaid subcontractor invoices totaling over $600,000. Cade's hands were on his knees, still and pale. These are preliminary, he began. 12 years with the SEC's Atlanta Enforcement Office, Prentice said, without heat, without hurry. I know what cyclical cash flow looks like. I know what insolvency dressed as cyclicality looks like. I know the difference between the two. Frances opened her portfolio. In the past 18 months, she said, looking at my daughter directly, Ridgetop Reserve LLC is drawn against a home equity line of credit secured by your marital residence. Total draws, $380,000. The line was opened jointly. The consent documents bear your signature, Laurel. She paused. A handwriting analysis indicates those signatures are not consistent with your authentic signature on record with the county. My daughter's grip on my hand tightened. Additionally, Frances continued, your inheritance account, funds left to you by your mother's estate, held solely in your name, was pledged as collateral for a commercial loan obtained by Ridgetop Reserve in September of last year. That pledge was executed without your knowledge or consent. She let that sit. The word forgery had not been spoken. It did not need to be. It was present in the room the way the crack in the doorframe was present in the next room. Specific, visible to anyone looking, requiring no decoration. Myron cleared his throat. His voice carried the graveled authority of 66 years of being the largest presence in every room. These are serious allegations. I'd strongly advise no one say another word without legal counsel. That's sound advice, Frances said pleasantly. I'd suggest you take it yourself, Mr. Hollenbeck. Your name appears as co-signatory on the commercial loan application from Volunteer Capital Partners. The application contains the same materially false figures Prentice just described. Under federal statute, 18 U.S.C. 1343, submitting false financial information to obtain commercial financing constitutes wire fraud. You are not a witness to what happened. You are a participant. Something moved in Myron's face that I had not seen there all evening. Uncertainty, not fear, not yet. Myron Hollenbeck was not a man who moved quickly to fear, but uncertainty, which in a man like him is its own species of damage, the first fracture in a foundation that had never expected to be tested from below. I spoke then. Everyone looked at me. I didn't bring these people here to threaten anyone, I said. I brought them because my daughter has been living inside a set of circumstances she didn't fully understand, and she deserved to understand them. What Frances and Prentice have described will now follow its own course through the appropriate institutions. I didn't design that course. The numbers Prentice found existed before tonight. The signatures Frances identified were forged before tonight. I made 2 phone calls. Everything else was already true. I looked at Cade. The difference between what I did and what you did, I said, is that what I did required the truth to already exist. What you did required it not to. His mouth opened, then closed. Across the room, my daughter reached across and picked up Prentice's legal pad. She read it. Not quickly. The way she has always read, carefully, deliberately, her finger moving lightly along the lines, her face still and concentrated. I had forgotten she reads that way. It came back to me now the way true things come back when you stop moving fast enough to receive them. I let the room be quiet around her because it was the only correct thing to do. When she finished, she set the legal pad on the cushion with the same quiet precision that Frances had used when she first placed her portfolio. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she looked at Cade. Did you forge my signature? She asked simply, already knowing. He looked at the floor. Did you take money from the account my mother left me? The floor again. My daughter nodded once, the nod of a person completing a calculation they've been circling for a long time. She stood up, not dramatically, not with the particular performance of a woman in crisis that we've all been trained to expect. She simply stood up the way a person stands when they have been sitting in the wrong place, and their body has finally decided it's finished sitting there. She looked at me. Dad, I want to leave. I stood beside her. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the piece of paper I had written on while I stood on the front step earlier, torn from the notepad I keep in my truck out of a 30-year habit of always having something to write on. 3 sentences. You don't have to decide anything tonight except whether to walk out this door. Everything else can wait. I have you. She unfolded it, read it, folded it back along its original creases, and put it in the pocket of her dress. She squared her shoulders. She looked at Cade one final time. I'll be in touch through Francis, she said. No anger, no performance. The 2 things it actually was, a fact and a conclusion. She turned toward the door. I walked beside her. Francis fell in quietly behind us. At the entryway, my daughter lifted her coat from the hook, where she had hung it when she arrived at her own home, and she put it on herself, buttoning each button from the bottom up, unhurried and deliberate. Behind us, Cade said her name. His voice cracked on it the way voices crack when a man finally feels the full weight of what he has lost. It may have been genuine. I have thought about that many times, and I don't have a clean answer, and I have decided it doesn't change anything. What is broken regardless of when the man holding the pieces begins to feel them. My daughter opened the front door and walked into the April night without hesitating. I followed. The door swung shut behind us on the warm candlelight and the Easter lilies and everything that had been built inside that house to look like something it was not. The 8 Escalades were still there. The people standing beside them turned as we came out. A small, quiet adjustment, the simple acknowledgement of people who have been waiting and understand the waiting is done. Frances came to stand beside us on the step. I'll have an emergency protective order filed before midnight, she said quietly and directly. That's a court order requiring Cade to vacate the marital residence within a specified window. You won't have to leave your own home, Laurel. He will. My daughter listened, nodded. Thank you, she said. Frances touched her arm briefly and stepped aside to make the call. We walked to my truck. It was the oldest vehicle in the cul-de-sac by a wide margin, and the cab smelled like motor oil and the pine air freshener I'd hung on the mirror in January. My daughter got in and closed the door and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and her eyes straight ahead, breathing. I started the engine. After a few miles, she asked, "How long did you know something was wrong?" I thought about it the way it deserved to be thought about. "The first time you called me from his phone instead of yours," I said. "About 14 months ago." She turned to look at me in the dark of the cab. "You didn't say anything." "If I had said something 14 months ago, you would have defended him," I said. "You would have explained all the reasons things were fine, because you were still inside it and you can't see the shape of something from inside it." I kept my eyes on the road. Some doors only open from the inside. I couldn't open it for you. I could only be standing there when you were ready. She was quiet for a long stretch of highway. The April dogwoods went past in the headlights, white and indifferent, and going on regardless. "I gave up my practice, Dad," she said eventually. Her voice was even, the voice of someone working through something they'd been carrying for a long time. "I gave up my clients. People I'd spent 4 years building trust with, one at a time. I gave up the office I rented on Cumberland Avenue, the one with the east-facing windows. I had good light all morning." Her voice caught briefly on that detail, the windows, the morning light, the particular texture of a thing surrendered that you cannot get back in the same form. "I thought I was choosing," she said. "I thought it was my decision." I drove for a moment without speaking. The highway stretched out ahead through the dark Tennessee countryside, redbud trees catching the headlights in the margins. "Your mother used to say," I said, "that the most dangerous thing a person can do to you is convince you that their idea was yours." My daughter was quiet, listening. "She said it about a contractor we hired once. Man talked me into a deck railing design I didn't want, dark green iron, completely wrong for the house. I ended up agreeing with him, and for years I couldn't explain exactly how it happened." A small sound came from the passenger seat, a laugh surprised out of her, the kind that arrives before you've decided to allow it, the kind more honest than the kind you choose. "Is it still there?" "I painted it white 3 months after she passed. Took me 4 hours, and I didn't tell anyone about it, which felt right." She laughed again, longer this time, not quite at the railing, at something underneath it, the small absurdity of men and their stubbornness, and the women who outlast both. It was her real laugh, the one I hadn't heard in 2 years, the one that used to come through the wall when she was home from college and on the phone with her friends, The one Patsy used to narrate from the kitchen with fond exasperation, that laugh again, as though the laugh were a separate creature living in the house that belonged to all of us. It filled the cab of the old truck and went up against the windows, and I kept my eyes on the highway and said nothing, because nothing I could say would improve on that sound. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, Francis. My daughter read the text, Epo granted. He has until 7 a.m. Good, I said. She set the phone back down and looked out the window. The clouds were breaking up above Granger County, and through the gaps there were stars, the thick, unhurried stars of a clear East Tennessee night, the kind you only see when you're far enough from everything else. Those people tonight, she said. Farrell, Francis, the others, they came on a Sunday evening. They came because I called, I said, and I could call because for 29 years I tried to do things the right way, paid what I owed, showed up when it mattered, put my name on things that were worth putting my name on. It accumulates. You don't notice it accumulating. And then one evening you need it to look like something, and it does. She thought about that for a while. I want to build that, she said. I want to be someone who has that. You already were, I said. You built a client list one relationship at a time, the right way. You'll have it again. You just couldn't see it from inside that house. She leaned back against the headrest and closed her eyes, and the tension I had been watching in her shoulders all evening, that long-held, bone-deep tension of a woman who has learned to monitor a room so constantly her body forgot what stillness felt like, began slowly and finally to release. We turned onto Maple Creek Road. The porch light was on, the way I always leave it when I go out at night, because a house should look like it's expecting you back. What followed in the 9 months after was not dramatic the way the evening had been dramatic. It was the slower, grinding work of institutions doing what they are built to do when given sufficient evidence and sufficient reason. The EPO was upheld. Francis filed with the state attorney's office in May. Prentice submitted his forensic analysis to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Atlanta in June. The federal exposure changed the arithmetic for Cade's attorneys considerably. State charges can sometimes be managed with the right local relationships, but federal charges have a different ceiling, and his attorneys knew it. In July, 9 subcontractors from 2 Rigidtop phases filed civil suits for unpaid work. They arrived one after another, each representing a small Tennessee business that had done the work in good faith and waited too long to receive what they were owed. The suits were not coordinated. They came the way truth comes, on its own schedule. Myron was named in 3 of the filings as a personal guarantor on project contracts. His exposure was no longer theoretical, and I received a phone call from him in August in which he asked if we could speak privately. I told him I didn't see the purpose. He said he wanted to explain himself. I said that what he had said at the Easter table had explained him thoroughly enough that no additional explanation was necessary. He did not call again. In September, Cade accepted a plea agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office, 1 count of wire fraud in connection with false financial statements submitted to Volunteer Capital Partners. 24 months, with supervised release following. Myron entered a separate agreement on his co-signatory liability, receiving a substantial fine and 2 years of probation. It was lighter than it should have been, and heavier than he'd believed possible in April. The divorce was finalized in October. My daughter received the marital residence, her inheritance account restored in full with interest, and a structured settlement that Francis described on the phone as appropriate given the circumstances. By then, my daughter had already signed a contract with a hotel development group in Nashville. Outdoor redesigns on 2 properties in Brentwood, the same kind of work she had been building toward before she set it down to become someone else's idea of a wife. She called me the morning she signed. "Dad," she said, "I have big windows again." I was in the garden when she called. I sat down on the wooden bench beside the tomato beds and held the phone and listened to my daughter describe her new office, the east-facing windows with the morning light, the first meeting where she'd walked in and presented her vision, and the room had listened, really listened, and how it had felt like recognizing something she had been afraid she'd forgotten. I didn't say much. Only, "That's good, Laurel. That's real good." December came around the way it always does, without asking permission. I was in the garage on a Saturday afternoon, working on a hinge on the side door that had been sticking since July. The kind of small, persistent problem that a reasonable person addresses immediately and that I had been walking past for 4 months, because there was always something else first. I heard her car in the driveway before I saw it, the used Volvo she'd bought herself in June, reliable, practical, exactly what she needed rather than what looked appropriate in someone else's driveway. She appeared in the garage doorway, filling the frame the way she always has, not because of her size but because of the quality of attention she brings with her, the way some people make a room aware of itself simply by entering it. You're still working on that hinge, she said. I'm working on it right now, I said. Dad, you've been walking past it since July. Things take the time they take. She came in and set the grocery bag she was carrying on the workbench and looked around the garage with the particular attention she's always had, the attention that cannot help cataloging a space even when it isn't working. She'd reorganized my tool wall in October, and the arrangement she'd come up with was better than the one I'd lived with for 12 years, which I had told her, and which she'd received with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has been seeing solutions to things for a long time and is finally again in a position to implement them. How's the Nashville project? I said. Good. She leaned us against the workbench, arms crossed, settling in for a real conversation rather than a brief one. We finished the South Terrace this week. The light in those rooms in the morning is exactly what I wanted. I had to fight the contractor for it. He thought I was being difficult. Were you? I was right, she said, which sometimes looks the same. I set my tool down and looked at my daughter standing in my garage in December, and I thought about Patsy saying almost exactly that sentence 20 years ago in this same garage, about a different contractor and a different argument, and the continuity of it moved through me in the particular way things move through you when you're 64, and have been paying attention long enough to see the thread that runs from one moment to another across decades. Dad, she said, can I ask you something? Always. Do you regret it, waiting as long as you did before stepping in? I thought about it the way it deserved to be thought about. I owed her the honest answer rather than the reassuring one, because she had spent enough time in a room where reassuring answers were handed out in place of honest ones. Every day, I said, and also no. She waited. Every day because you were hurting and I was watching and telling myself it wasn't mine to address. Also no, because if I'd stepped in 14 months ago, you would have explained why everything was fine. You were still inside it and you couldn't see the shape of it yet. I turned the tool in my hands. Some doors only open from the inside. I couldn't open it for you. I could only be standing in the driveway when you were ready to walk out. She absorbed this for a long time. Outside, the December afternoon was moving toward its early dark, the bare oak branches going silver in the last of the light. Mom would have come sooner, she said finally. Your mother once filed a noise complaint against a lawnmower she disagreed with on principle, I said. She was capable of anything. My daughter laughed, the full laugh, the one that goes up into the garage rafters and comes back down. The one I hadn't heard in 2 years and had been counting the time without, and I let it fill the space before I said another word. Staying for dinner, I asked. She lifted the grocery bag from the workbench. I found Mom's chicken and rice recipe, the one with the time. I set the hinge tool down on the workbench. I clicked off the work lamp. I looked around the garage for a moment in the last of the afternoon light, the organized tools, the old truck in its spot, the door that now swung clean and right the way it was always supposed to, and then I followed my daughter into the house. The kitchen light was on and warm. She was already at the counter setting things out in her organized way, the way she does everything now. Deliberate, sure, entirely her own. The house had the sound of itself again, 2 people in it. Outside through the window, the first snow of December was coming down in small and unhurried flakes, taking their time, in no particular hurry to reach the ground. I washed my hands at the sink. Already smells good, I said. I haven't started yet, she said. I know, I said, smells good anyway. There is a moment in every family story, if you are patient enough and paying close enough attention, when you realize the ending was always there, quiet and waiting, like a door that was never locked, only never tried. I am 64 years old. I drive an old truck and grow tomatoes and leave them at the end of the driveway on Saturday mornings for $2 or whatever you've got. I let people decide what I was worth by what they could see, and I never corrected them. I don't regret any of that. But I do regret the months I spent watching and waiting, and telling myself my daughter was an adult, and it wasn't mine to address. Don't be like me in that part. The moment is never right. The conditions are never perfect. You step in anyway, imperfectly, incompletely, in old trucks on cold evenings, with grease still under your thumbnail, but present, always present. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. It means more than you know. Leave a comment below, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if any part of this reached you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. This has been Daddy's Revenge Stories.